Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about gross domestic product and learn how to calculate GDP. Here we are going to look at some of the key macroeconomic objectives of government. The first goal is to have price stability. So basically the government will pursue price stability, which means that the general price level in an economy does not change much over time. Okay? Means that the price neither go up or down, so there is no significant decrease of inflation or deflation. And this will bring us to the definition of the inflation rate, which is a measure of how much price is in general are increasing in an economy. The second economic goal is to have low unemployment rate. And by saying low unemployment rate, we don't mean to have zero rate. Okay, so the unemployment rate is a measure of how many of the people who are willing and able to work are not currently working. So in another word, it is the percentage of total labor force that is unemployed but actively seeking employment and willing to work. So remember, having low unemployment rate does not mean zero unemployment rate. The third goal is to have high and sustained economic growth. And our goal is to have a rate of growth which can be maintained without creating significant economic problem. Why? Because if a growth rise significantly, okay, the economy is experiencing excessive growth or low growth. So remember, our goal to have high and sustained growth in the economy. Now, what is GDP? GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product and is defined as the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a given period of time by a factor of production located within a country. Now, the key word here is to have final goods and services. So, some people produce goods like, let's say, car or clothes. Other produce service like doctors or hairdresser. Okay, so if you add up the value of these finished good and service, you will get your gross domestic product. Okay, and for a given period, it means that usually GDP is calculated on annual basis. It can be also calculated on quarterly basis as well. Okay, within a country, which means that for a specific country, so each country has their own GDP. Now, in order to calculate GDP, we need to know what gets counted and what doesn't. Therefore, remember, only goods and services produced domestically are included within the GDP. That means that the goods produced by Bahrainis outside the Bahrain will not be counted as part of GDP. So any final goods and service produced outside the country border would not be measured in the GDP. Okay, so anything we produce inside the Bahrain, okay, in Bahrain we're going to be counted as part of our GDP. GDP is used as a measure of the economic growth in a certain country. So basically, GDP provides an economic snapshot of a country, which is used to estimate the size of economies and also the growth rate. Why only final goods and service? So as we saw earlier, the GDP only includes final goods and services. Okay, so GDP only includes final product, which are goods for sale, rather than intermediate goods that are used to make final product. So let's look at this example. Let's say that the market value or selling price of the wheat is $3. Okay, and then we are able to turn that into flour with the market value of $5. Okay, and we keep going until we get the finished product of bread, which has a market value, let's say, of $10. Okay, so as we said that the contribution of GDP will just be this final product. It will just be the $10 worth of bread. And this is what the customer is willing to pay for it. We will not count all of these intermediary goods, which is in this case are the wheat and the flour, to avoid the double counting. Okay, so we won't take this in our calculation when we want to calculate the GDP, because these are intermediary goods. Okay, so to avoid the double counting the income generated, because the expenditure of intermediate goods, in this case the wheat and flour, are included in the market value of expenditure made on the bread. So the $3 and the $5 are already included in the $10. So in order to avoid the double counting, we will not include any intermediary goods. We only include the final goods. Final goods and services. The term final goods and services in GDP refers to goods and services produced, as we said, for final use. This is what we measure with the expenditure method. We will see the two methods later in this chapter. While intermediate goods are goods produced by one firm for use in further processing by another firm. So in another word, intermediate goods are items that we use to create another product, and these products have not finished their journey yet when somebody or a company buys them. So a product may be either an intermediate or consumer good, depend on who buys it. So if I buy a salt and take it home for everybody in the household to consume, it is a consumer good and it is considered as a final good. But when baker, on the other hand, buys salt to add to their product, it is an intermediate good. It is not the end of the journey for the salt. So after adding the salt to bread, the baker then sells the bread to the final consumer, and the bread in this case is the final good. Exclusion of used goods and paper transactions. So GDP ignores all transactions in which money or goods change hands, but in which no new goods and services are produced. There are items that do not get considered as part of GDP. For example, sale of used goods and paper transaction. No used goods are included. For example, when Miriam purchases a car from her father or resell a book she received from her father, these transactions are not counted in the GDP. So only new produced goods are counted in GDP. For example, if I bought a car worth 10,000 BD in 2018, the 10,000 BD counted in 2018 GDP. Then I decide to sell the car in 2020. Does it count in 2020 GDP? No, it won't be counted in 2020 GDP because it was already counted in 2018 GDP. So, if we count it in this year GDP, we are double counting it. So the point is that we only count the new goods and service in our GDP. Okay. We also don't include paper transaction in our GDP calculation. And paper transaction, for example, stocks and bonds, don't get counted in GDP as they are purely financial transactions. Okay, the third item that is excluded is gross national product, GNP. Okay, so when we calculate the GDP, we are focusing here about the goods that are produced inside a country border, so inside Bahrain. Okay, while GNP is looking at everyone who would be citizen of a country regardless of where it's made. So to make it clear, let's take this example. So let's say we have we have a car company. Let's go with Toyota. Toyota decide to build a plant in the United States. Okay, so if Toyota build a plant in the United States and they are producing cars in the US, that would be factored in the US GDP, right? Because we are selling car in the inside the US, so it will be part of it will be part of US GDP. However, it won't be part of US gross national product or GNP. Why? Because Toyota is not an American company. Toyota's GNP would be factored into Japan's. Okay, why? Because they are Japanese company. So here GNP counts production by Japanese worker or Japanese owned enterprise wherever they are located. Okay, so any product that is produced outside our country border will not be counted in our GDP. Okay, there are two primary methods or formulas by which GDP can be determined: the expenditure approach, okay, and the income approach. The expenditure approach measure of how much people from different sectors of society have spent on goods and service produced, so how much they paid on these products and services, while the income approach measure how much people earned from selling or providing service in particular countries. So how much they earn from the selling. Here, how much the expenditure approach is how much you paid for these products and services. Now, we are going to focus on expenditure approach in this chapter. So we are going to calculate GDP under the expenditure approach. Now, we need to take three things into consideration when we are calculating the GDP under expenditure approach. The first thing is we only measure the market value, okay? And when we are saying the market value, we mean the price times the quantity produced of all final goods and service produced in the economy. As we said earlier, we will not count the intermediate goods, only the final goods. During a specific time period, this measure is often taken during each quarter or annually, so it depends. The second point is we measure only the goods and service produced within a country border. We mentioned that earlier as well. So anything produced, for example, inside Bahrain will be part of our GDP. If our Bahraini citizens are producing product, and let's say, for example, in Dubai, it won't be counted in our GDP, right? It will be counted in our GNP, which is gross national product. The third point is we must measure real increase in production, not only nominal. We are going to discuss the difference between real GDP and nominal GDP later in this chapter, but keep in mind that we measure the real increase in the production, not only the nominal. Now, what is included in the GDP? So how we are going to calculate our GDP? Now, the expenditure method is a system for calculating gross domestic product, GDP, that combines consumption, investment, government spending, and net export. Okay? Now, consumption expenditure. What do we mean by consumption expenditure? It's basically spending by consumer. So spending by consumer on goods and service. So basically it shows how much households are spending and what they are spending their income on. Example, when the household purchases of product for their everyday needs like food, clothes, cars, rent, and so on. It's all going to be part of consumption expenditure. The second component is private investment expenditure. Okay, so spending by a business on new factories or equipment and any addition to a firm inventory. Keep in mind, new factories or equipment, not used, not old, new factories or equipment and any addition to a firm inventory. So, for example, if you have a factory, you will buy equipment to run your factory, right? You will buy, for example, inventory, tools, machinery, and so on. So all of these will be part of private investment expenditure, and including the sale of newly produced housing. Okay, the sale of an existing home by its owner is not counted. So Let's say I have a real estate company that's selling newly houses to their consumers, so it will be counted under private investment expenditure. We will not count the existing home by its owner. Why? Because it's already had been counted in that year. Okay, so only new houses will be part of private investment expenditure. To avoid the double counting, we are not going to count the existing home. The third component is government purchases. It is spending by the government on newly produced goods and services. This includes all of the wages and benefits paid to the government workers in all of these areas, since the government purchases their service. So basically, government purchases is the sum of government expenditures on final goods and services. It includes, for example, salaries of the public servants, purchases of weapons for the military, and any investment expenditure by a government. And the last component is net exports. Okay, and net exports is exports minus import. Now, exports are sale to foreigners of the country's produced goods and services. The definition of an export is something that is shipped or brought to another country to be sold or traded. An example of export is, for example, let's say fruits being shipped from Bahrain to be sold in other country. While imports is the other way around. It is the country purchases of goods and services from abroad. And finally, in order to calculate the net exports, basically you deduct the imports from the exports. And you will have a positive if the exports are greater than imports, and negative if the imports are greater than exports. As we saw earlier, that private investment expenditure is part of GDP, and this brings us to gross private domestic investment, which is basically measure of the amount of money that domestic or local businesses invest within their own country. Okay, GPDI is one component of GDP, and it has three categories: non-residential investment, residential investment, and change in inventories. Non-residential investment include expenditure by a firm for machines, tools, plants, and so on. So as I said earlier, if let's say for example, factory want to operate his business, so he need to buy tools, he need to buy machines, and so on. Residential investment include expenditure by a household and firm on new houses and apartment building. So if a household or a company or a firm wants to buy a new houses or apartment, it's going to be a part of residential investment. And finally, change in inventories. Change in inventories computes the amount by which firm inventories change during a given period. Remember, inventories are goods that the firm produce now but intend to sell later. So they are going to produce these products now, okay, but they are going to sell it in the future. So the increase in business inventories are counted in the calculation of GDP, so that new goods that are produced but unsold are still counted in the year in which they are computed. Okay, now the following equation is used to calculate the GDP, okay, which is C plus I plus G plus X minus M, okay, where C equals spending by a consumer, I equals to investment by a business, G equals to government spending, and X equal to export, and M equals to import. Okay. Now note there are also components of aggregate demand. So the component of aggregate demand are identical to the component that are used to calculate real GDP using the expenditure approach. Okay. So means that they rise and fall together. Now in this slide we have Bahrain GDP composition in 2015. Okay, household consumption represent 44.9%, which is the blue area. Okay, now if you notice that household final consumption expenditure is typically the largest component of final use of GDP. And then we have a government consumption 16.6%. Okay, and both investment in fixed capital and investment in inventories are part of investment, and which add up to 18.4%, the orange area. And finally NX, which is net export. Basically it's import deducted from the export, so we deduct the 32.2% minus we deduct it from 52.3%, okay, which is 20%. Here we have a list of activities, and we need to decide whether these activities are part of GDP. Now always remember the equation that is used to calculate the GDP, okay? And check whether these activities has any impact on the GDP equation or GDP 5 components, okay? A woman picks flower in her garden. So there is no impact on our GDP because there is no exchange of goods or services, and it has no impact on any of the 5 components. Fruits are sold on the market, so it has an impact because there is exchange of goods and the service in the market. So basically there is exchange of fruit in the market, and it will impact also our consumption, because as you remember, consumption basically means it basically means individual consume product or service, so they bought the fruit, so it will increase the consumption expenditure. C, patient hurt in a car accident are treated in a hospital, so there is exchange in this case, and it could be either consumption or government purchases. So for example, if this patient went to a private hospital, okay, so he's going to spend some money, right, in order to receive the treatment from the private hospital, so it will have an impact on the consumption expenditure. But if this patient decide to go to a public hospital or government hospital, so it will have an impact on the government purchases, so it depends. Okay, the pensioners do community work for free, so there is no impact on the GDP because there is no exchange of goods or service. They didn't pay anything, they did it for free, and it has no impact on the GDP component. And finally, a garage buys spare tires to sell them to a customer next year. So they buy the tire today, okay, and they intend to sell these tires in the future, right? So this is considered as an inventory, and you remember that inventory is part of investment. Let's look at this exercise, okay? They want us to calculate the GDP. Okay, calculate GDP if consumption equal to 310, investment 115, government purchases 60, export 305, import 245. So remember, before you answer, write the formula. You remember the formula of GDP under the expenditure method. Okay, so we know our C 310, investment 115, government purchases 60, and net export is basically export 305 minus 245, so the total GDP is 545.